Are you sick of blown out skies and dirty, noisy shadows in your landscape photography? Well, you've probably heard people say that you should be doing exposure bracketing. And in this video right here, I'm going to show you the most efficient way to do that and help you to understand how to get professional quality landscape photography images, kind of like mine. If you don't know me, I'm Gavin Hardcastle and I make pretty pictures for a living. I produce photography books like these, fine art photography prints and online photography courses. And I've been doing this professionally for over a decade and I use exposure bracketing for 90% of the images that go into my portfolio. If you're new to this channel, or even if you're not, do me a favour and just hit that subscribe button down there so that you get updates when I post new videos. Okay, so now let me take you on location and I'm going to show you exactly how I do exposure bracketing. So I figured I'd pick a challenging subject with this sea arch in Newfoundland. Alright, so while we wait for the light to get good, let's talk about bracketing and why I don't use, very often anyway, auto exposure bracketing. This is something that I've been teaching to my students for over a decade now. I think people just automatically use auto exposure bracketing thinking that that's what they've got to do, but I much prefer to shoot just manual brackets, just 2 if I can get away with it rather than 3 or 5. And I think the main reason why I started doing this way back in the day is because one of my cameras, my digital cameras, just didn't have that function. It didn't have auto exposure bracketing. So I just got really used to doing it manually. And then when I finally did get a camera that did have auto exposure bracketing, I started using it obviously, but I found that my memory cards just filled up with way too many wasted images. And it was much simpler to find and put together the manually bracketed shots that I'd been used to shooting for quite some time. So that's just stuck with me. And so when I show this to my students, it's a bit of a revelation that you can actually usually just get what you want in 2 frames. And it's so much better on your hard drives and your memory cards. But I'll show you the back of the camera, we'll do a test shot and I'll explain my methodology here. Okay, so for the beginners out there, why would you want to bracket? Well, you bracket for dynamic range. There's a huge contrast between that basically white, it's completely blown out, whited out opening in the cave, and then the actual cave itself. So that dynamic range, that extreme contrast, on most cameras you can't capture it in 1 frame. So you have to shoot a darker frame and a lighter frame, sometimes 3 to 5 frames, depending on how extreme that dynamic range is. So why do we call it bracketing and what is auto exposure bracketing? Well, if you're going to take 3 exposures of the same shot, you've got 1 at the correct exposure and then 2 extra exposures. One of those is underexposed and the other is overexposed. So those 2 extra frames are like brackets around that first exposure. Auto exposure bracketing is where you set your camera to automatically shoot those extra frames just by hitting the shutter button 1 time. So for 1 push of the shutter button, your camera will take 3 or more exposures. So the more extreme your dynamic range, the more frames you're going to have to shoot. With this camera though, I've got a gazillion stops of dynamic range, so I know I can get this in 2. So what I typically do, I'll just lock this down, you don't want any movement in between your 2 frames or 3 frames or whatever it is. What I'll typically do, obviously I've focused, I've composed the shot. What I'll usually do is I'll take a shot that is supposedly the correct exposure. If you look at that, you can see I've exposed for the highlights there. Well, everything else is completely black. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to underexpose this until I can see the detail in my highlights in that bright spot. So I'm just going to go ahead and take that shot, knowing that that's going to work for my highlights in the sky there. And in this case, because we're dealing with a cave basically, I'm going to take a very, very overexposed shot until I can see all of that detail up there in the top of the frame. So I'm going to take that shot. Now a little tip I'll give you is when you do this really overexposed frame, you're probably going to get a lot of lens flare around the edges of this, in this case, the cave mouth. I'm going to get my hand in the frame like this and I'm going to kind of try to emulate that shape. I'm just going to block that out a little bit, just like that, and then I'll take that shot. I can't do it right now because I don't have a third arm. But basically, that's going to fix any lens flare that's coming from this bright area that might disrupt all of the other things, like the cave roof there might have ugly lens flare in it. But if you just block out the main light source like that, it's perfectly fine. And then of course, you're going to have to blend that in Photoshop using layers.
Keep watching till the end, because I'm going to give you a free tutorial showing you how I blend that hand exposure, but it's actually in Luminar Neo.
And again, the reason why I do this is to save on images. You know, images don't really cost you anything, but I don't want my memory card getting full up, and I don't want to have to deal with thousands more images than is necessary on my hard drives. And what I found is that when I use auto exposure bracketing, let's say I've got just a couple of stops in between each of those shots with auto exposure bracketing. I'll take my shot, it'll take all three, I'll look at them and realize, actually, I should have gone a little bit wider. I should have had more dynamic range. I'll do another three. You try that, and it's still not right. Before you know it, you've got 9 images where 2 or 3 would have done, which would have been easy if you just shot them manually.
So whether you use auto exposure bracketing or not, either way, you have to blend those exposures. Now you could use a simple HDR tool, which might look okay, or you could do some more advanced exposure blending, which I cover in my new course, Exposure Blending Simplified. There's a link in the description if you're interested, and it's on sale right now.
The light's just starting to get really nice right now, and I've decided to do a pano from a little bit further back, looking at a bit of a diagonal instead of straight on, and that was all my idea.
No, it wasn't. It was mine.
It was her idea. You have some good ideas sometimes, don't you, love?
Yeah, I usually do.
Now when it comes to slow moving panos, there's another reason why I prefer to bracket manually. Okay, so what you're looking at here is the finished panorama, and this is actually a HDR panorama. Now these days I hardly ever use HDR, but I figured I'd just put a little HDR section into my exposure blending simplified course, because it would just be weird if I didn't. So looking at this panorama, I actually managed to do this with just 2 sets of exposures. But the reason why this worked a lot better without having auto exposure bracketing on is because look at this side of the frame. So this side of the frame has 2 exposures, and if you look at the brightest part of the sky there is no sun. So I was able to capture all of the dynamic range that I wanted with just 2 exposures. Now when it came to the other side of the composition, this has the sun in it. So this frame required 3 exposures. And that's why I prefer to bracket manually, because I ended up with only the frames that I needed for this part of the composition and also for this part of the composition.
Now you might be thinking, is it really that big of a problem if I use auto exposure bracketing and I end up with a few frames? Well, it depends on your style of photography, but let me tell you, things can add up real quick. For example, if you're shooting focus stacks, if you're shooting a panorama, if you're shooting a time blend where you're trying to capture different cloud positions or a wave moving into the scene, your memory card can clog up real quick. And what you don't want is for your memory card to clog up at the penultimate moment of glorious light and you miss the shot because you were too busy faffing around deleting images or putting a new memory card in. All right, so I've come back to my spot in the middle. So I really liked it over there where Amanda had found, but I found that if I was over in that corner, I would lose this area of the composition here. You see this beautiful crenellated wall here with this lovely light bouncing off it, and that's quite an important feature as far as I'm concerned. So I've moved back over to the center, and what I'm actually waiting for now is the sun to go down, because my favorite kind of light is after the sun has gone down or just before the sun has risen. It's a lot softer. You still usually have to bracket, but not as many frames. Then I can definitely get it in 2. With this right now, I'm having to do it in 3 because, I mean, look at this. The dynamic range is ridiculous. Those highlights are completely blown out. and then the shadows are extremely dark. So, you know, this has taken a bit more effort. But as I said, that post-sunset light is always more moody, always prettier, richer colours, and then I think I'll be able to do it in just 2 brackets. The sun is about there, and when it goes down over the horizon, there's not much blocking the sun at that point. And when that happens, any other clouds that are up in the sky, like I can see loads over there, they can sometimes ignite. So you never know, this might actually erupt. Wouldn't that be good, love? Our last night, a fantastic sunset.
Oh, I love a good eruption.
As the sun began to drop over the horizon, the moment had finally arrived.
Well, it hasn't quite been a full eruption, but it's been a partial eruption. Some lovely purples and pinks which contrast nicely against the sort of slate grey, almost blue clouds and the ocean there. So I think this one's going to turn out to be fairly decent. If it does, here's a shot.
For this one, I used manual exposure blending, just like in my course, Exposure Blending Simplified, on sale right now. All right, that's the last plug, I promise.
Now, do you remember that shot that I took where I had to use my hand to block out the sun? You might have been thinking, well, how's he going to blend that? Well, I've put together a free tutorial for you, which you can watch right now over on my fototripper studio channel. So there's a link to that right here and in the description. Oh, and I just want to say a huge thank you to all of my supporters on the Unmentionable platform. Here they are, you absolute legends.